Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to your newest lesson from the team here at fullskillsexamprep.com. So, dependent children is definitely a big topic in your upcoming ICCRC Full Skills Exam. The reason why, of course, this is a big topic in your exam is simply because this plays a role in your work as RCICs. So, we're going to look at this, of course, through the scope of the upcoming ICCRC Full Skills Exam in this video. But really, there's a deeper meaning to this because you're going to have people, once you pass the exam, of course, once you're an RCIC and you have your business organized, you're going to have people who come up to you who want to immigrate to Canada. And you'll have a little chat with these people. And for a lot of them, the reason why they want to immigrate is because, in our experience anyways, the demographic that we get is usually people who are aged maybe 20, let's say 25 to 45. I would say that's about the demographic that we get on the immigration side of the company that I work for. And usually these people have children, and once they have children, they start to think about the future a little bit more, and they want kind of different options for their kids. So usually these people have great jobs, lots of experience, they're professionals, they speak English at a certain level, and for you as an RCIC, usually you're looking at what their intent is. So do they want to move specifically to Winnipeg to be with family, or do they want to be free to move anywhere in Canada, or do they want to go to Quebec? And with this, you're of course looking at immigration options for this person. And dependent children, of course, plays a huge role in this because even if a person is a perfect candidate for, let's say, express entry, well, if the reason this person wants to move to Canada is to provide a better future for his or her children, for you as the immigration consultant, you need to think very deeply, of course, and analyze not only if this person qualifies for express entry and exceeds the CRS cutoff score, but also if this person's children would qualify as dependent children. So it's something that you're going to have kind of a checklist you go through in your mind when you're interviewing people. And this is definitely one of the elements that you are definitely going to think about because for some people, they have a bit of a misconception. We're going to see this later on in the video, of course, with what a dependent child is. They think that simply if a child is living at home and that child is 25 and unemployed, that makes the child a dependent child. So part of your job, of course, is to educate people, educate the public about what a dependent child actually is, and then, of course, see if this changes the person's immigration plan. Maybe even if the person has a child who's 25 years old, well, maybe the child maybe qualifies for an immigration program and can immigrate separately. All right, so that's a bit of a preamble here, but we're going to jump into the lesson now. So I hope you enjoy it. It's been a pleasure making this lesson. And for all of you, of course, keep up the good work. This lesson is going to be about an hour long. Then you have your 3 sample questions after this. But of course, the court cases at the end here, I think, really help you to tie everything together. Now, you've probably worked through these manuals already, and you've probably gone through the IRCC website, as well as it pertains to sponsoring children. You're going to see that this lesson here really touches upon all those lessons we talked about before, so adopted children, spouses, common law partners, conjugal partners, etc. Now, the manuals are a really good way to transform that information that you have regarding Regulation 117 into a little bit more of an in-depth analysis. For the most part, these manuals are up to date as well. They were updated in mid-2016. So you're in a pretty good position. There's one, however, that hasn't really been updated. So some of the changes you're going to see, we'll talk about this later on again, is with regard to the dependent children and their age. That's something we're going to touch upon, but remember, it's not 22. You're going to see the age of 22 in some places, in these manuals sometimes, and on the government website sometimes, but that rule changed. So just don't get tricked with that. It's a tricky little area. I don't want you to get confused, so we're going to talk about this again in a few minutes. But as a starting point after this lesson, it's really important for you to go through OP1, OP2, IP2, and of course the IRCC or the CIC website section dealing with sponsorship of children. So everything's linked for you on the webpage here. If you're watching this lesson on YouTube, be sure to go to our website, fullskillsexamprep.com, and just go to the free lessons section. We have everything waiting there for you. So we have all the links for all these resources, the articles, the court cases, everything like that. All right, IP8 is a really important one as well. And you can see that just like a lot of the other family class sections that we took a look at, Regulation 117 is 1,000,000% essential. And you might think it's only one article, but it's a pretty big article, and it goes all the way really through 133. So be sure to really have a thorough understanding of Regulation 117. But remember, of course, to have a really thorough understanding of Regulation 117 and all the manuals really as they pertain to your upcoming ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So as you know, understanding the definition of various family members is pretty tricky. It can be pretty tricky, especially with regard to your upcoming full skills exam. So let's break this down into a simpler way of analyzing these relationships. So on the one side, you have the sponsor. Now the sponsor would be, just like all the other sponsor requirements that we saw in the previous lessons, he or she would have to be a citizen, permanent resident, 18 or older, residing or will reside in Canada, etc. So we took a look at all of those requirements in depth in the previous lessons. But what we are looking at specifically with regard to dependent children is whether or not the dependent child is accompanying the sponsor or not accompanying. Now we're going to take a look at each of these thoroughly over the course of the lesson, just to give you those building blocks to be able to master this topic as it relates to your upcoming full skills exam. Now, as you may know, if you've been working through the simulation questions, you probably have an idea of this already. Now, this is only half of the equation, because as we saw or will see in the spouse, common law, and conjugal partner lesson, we have to take a look at dependent children as they relate to the sponsored spouse, common law partner, or conjugal partner. And this again would be an accompanying dependent child of that sponsored spouse, common law partner, conjugal partner, or maybe that sponsored spouse, common law partner, conjugal partner has an unaccompanying dependent child. So we're going to take a look at all these little areas as it relates to your full skills exam, and we're going to go through some little tricky, tiny areas just so that you're aware of them. You probably learned this in your course, but we'll take a look again just to refresh your knowledge on the topic, and of course so you can see some of these potentially tricky areas that might pop up on your exam. And of course these tricky areas are going to pop up in real life once you're working as an IRCC, as an RCIC as well. One little tiny thing is dependent children of dependent children. So we'll take a look at this as well. So let's talk about the definition of a dependent child, because this is something that we're definitely going to focus on. Well, we can see this in Regulation 117. So they talk about the dependent child, of course, as it relates to the sponsor. So remember, of course, both parties really are incredibly important to understand in deciphering what really is a dependent child and how can this present itself in the ICCRC Full Skills Exam. Well, Regulation 2 provides a really fantastic summary of this. So we talked about adopted children before, We talked about really all the other elements of the family class already. Well, dependent children certainly play a role as being able to be sponsored in the family class, but also when they are with somebody who's going to be sponsored as a spouse, so the dependent child of a spouse or common law partner. So this is certainly an important area for us to look at. So there are a few little pieces here that should jump out at you. So we have the biological child of the parent, all right, or we have the adopted child of the parent under A. Okay, and then we have this age. So the age over here is 22. Now this has been the case since October 2017. So for all of you, the 90-day cutoff has passed, of course, for this. So for all of you, if you ever see something about a dependent child being 19 or under, that means you're looking at something that is older, so some older information that you found. But of course, the age now is under 22, so that means 21 and under. All right, then we have the exceptions in B. So we have, of course, well, first of all, for B1, the person has to be under 22 and not a spouse or common law partner, because that makes the person unable to be sponsored as a dependent child. And then we have, of course, this exception over here, and that is somebody who is unable to be self-supporting on their own, but not because they're unemployed or because they're in school. It's because of a physical or mental condition. So we get this quite a bit as well with even with life as an RCIC, with clients who are a bit older. So maybe clients who are, let's say, 50 years old, and they have children who are maybe 25 and 29, and they often want their kids to, or they're curious about whether or not their kids can be sponsored to immigrate to Canada with them. Well, the answer, of course, is no, because unless they have this very, very, very specific condition here. All right, so the answer is usually no over there. Though, of course, if people are a bit younger and their kids are younger, 21 or under, well, then, of course, they can be accompanying. Now, just to further this explanation, there are two types of dependent children. So we're going to take a look at an example of both of these over this upcoming video here. We'll have a little activity later on. So we have a child who is under the age of 22 and single. So when I say single, I don't mean doesn't have a girlfriend or boyfriend or isn't dating anyone. That doesn't really matter. And even just to reiterate what we talked about with spouses and common law partners and conjugal partners, when people date other people or people have boyfriends or girlfriends, in terms of immigration, it doesn't really matter. It's not considered a relationship, really. So it's the same as being single. Now, being single, of course, in this case means simply isn't married, is not in a common law relationship. So that's the type 1. And this, I think, is more common. Then you have type 2. So type 2 deals with the exceptions. So you have someone who is 22 years of age or older, but they are unable to make themselves financially independent because they have a physical or mental condition. So like I said before, this isn't someone who is simply unemployed or someone who can't find a job in his field or someone who is maybe a university student, so the person doesn't have enough money to become financially independent or lives with their parents still or anything like that. It's pretty serious. It's only people who are financially dependent because they have a physical or mental condition, and they have to have been financially dependent before the age of 22 as well. So it can't be somebody who is 30 years old, let's say, and somebody has an accident at work, and they maybe, let's say, somebody broke his leg and he's confined to a bed at his parents' house, so his parents are taking care of him. Well, that person isn't now a dependent child. This would have to be obviously a lot more serious of a physical condition. And it would have had to have been the case before the person turned 22, of course. Okay, and then just like everything, I'll reiterate this at the end of the video, but just like everything in immigration, of course, the requirements, and we're talking about dependent children here, but really it's for everything in immigration. The requirements have to be met on the day the officer receives the completed application, and of course at the time the person receives the visa, and also when they enter Canada. All right, so that's, I think, a really important element to understand with your exam and with immigration in general, because it plays a role, of course, across the whole spectrum of immigration, not only in the family class with dependent children. All right, so that concludes part of this, and that is a sponsor who is a Canadian citizen, a permanent resident, he's 18 or over. He's not ineligible to sponsor a family member. And now we know the definition and what's required in order for him to sponsor an accompanying or unaccompanying dependent child. But what we need to really take a look at in order to complete our understanding of this topic is when that sponsor sponsors a spouse, common law partner, conjugal partner, and that partner has dependent children. So let's take a look at this as well. So we have the definition of a dependent child, but we need to take a step back, of course, and look at the definition of a family member. Because remember, of course, someone needs to meet all of these definitions in order to immigrate. So we could see, of course, that a family member is a spouse or common law partner. So we saw the sponsor already. We've been studying spouse and family law, a common law partner for quite some time. If you've gone through that lesson, it's a very thorough lesson. Certainly spouses and common law partners and conjugal partners play a huge role on your exam. So it's a really thorough lesson, and it's something that you definitely will need to go through in detail. So we have the dependent child of that common law partner or spouse. So this is really important. And grandchildren, so a dependent child of a dependent child. But remember that first dependent child, so the parent of the grandchild, would still need to meet those requirements of being a dependent child. All right, so now you have a better understanding of all of these tricky little areas that might be on your full skills exam. So we talked about accompanying dependent child of a sponsor, himself or herself, an unaccompanying dependent child, and we're going to take a look at that one a little bit more later on in the lesson. Essentially, it's the same as all the other family class, where a person has to be declared. But we'll take a look at that pretty thoroughly later on. Remember that a sponsor, if he's sponsoring a spouse, common law partner, and that spouse or common law partner has dependent children, whether or not they're accompanying, essentially they have to meet nearly the exact same requirements as the sponsor's own children. And essentially that's going to be the legal relationship as well. And dependent children of dependent children is a tricky little area as well. We'll analyze this through an activity actually coming up. So let's take a look at I think a very common scenario for real life as a consultant, and of course related to your exam. So here we have Mariam. Now Mariam is a Canadian citizen who was born in Iran, and she met and fell in love with Reza. So Reza is Iranian. Now Reza, so they get married, and then Reza already has a kid. His name is Reza Jr. He is 8 years old. He lives with Reza, so Reza has full custody. Now, does he meet the definition of a dependent child? And I'll give you just 20 little seconds here to think about this, and of course to try to prove your answer. All right, well, based on what we saw already, we know that the answer is yes. Because of this. Well, the person definitely falls, Reza Jr. falls under the category, of course, as a dependent child of the person's spouse or common law partner. So this, when they say the person, they would mean Reza, of course, and Miriam would be, oh, pardon me, the opposite. Miriam is the person and Reza is the spouse in this case. And of course, Reza Jr. is only 8 years old. He's certainly under 22. Obviously, he's not a spouse or common law partner. So this would be a pretty easy scenario. We're going to take a look at a bit of a tricky one in the next slide here. All right, so I've got a pretty fun activity for you here. Now here we have Maria. So Maria is a Canadian. She was born in, well, let's say Winnipeg. And she met and fell in love with Tony. So Tony is from Peru. And what we're going to decipher is this situation where Maria is going to sponsor Tony as her common law partner. So let's say that they've been living together for 15 months and they meet all those requirements of being in a common law relationship. And Tony is the happiest person in the world because he has 5 kids. All right, so all of these kids, and this is what we're going to do for the activity, is see which ones can be eligible as accompanying. So the first child, well, child is 18, is named Marco. He's 18. We have Olivia, who's 19, Alberto, who's 20, Beyonce, who's 22, and Emilio, who is also 22. All right, so those two are twins. Now, Marco is single. He's 18. Olivia is married at 19. Alberto is single. Beyonce is also single. And Emilio is in a common law relationship. So remember, for common law, it means it's almost like a marriage, of course. So Marco works full time, and the other kids are financially dependent on Tony. All right, so Tony is, of course, really happy because he has 5 kids. It might be a little bit stressful for him because 4 of those kids are financially dependent on him. But we have to, of course, ask ourselves whether or not this affects their eligibility in order to be considered dependent children. So the reason why Olivia is financially dependent on Tony is because she is a student. Okay, for Alberto, he's also a student. Beyonce has a physical disability. And Emilio is also a student. But there's another little piece to this puzzle. So Tony, like I said, is really happy because he's got 5 kids, but he is extra happy because he has 5 grandkids, because all of his kids have a kid. All right, so what we're going to ask ourselves, of course, is which ones will be eligible as accompanying in this case. So if you want to pause the video and work through this on your own, I think it's a really great idea. And if you want to continue, I'll give you, I'll give you 30 seconds here, anyways, to work through this. And hopefully you're going to go through your test day data booklet. You'll find the answers to this. And of course, hopefully we'll have the exact same answers. So your 30 seconds will begin now. All right, so let's continue on here. I hope you got all of these correct. Let's work through them one by one, and we'll see just how correct you are. So let's see how we did here. So we have Marco, who is 18, and he's single, has a full-time job. Well, we need to, of course, prove our answer. So maybe you said yes, maybe you said no, and that's great. If you got the correct answer, that's really great as well. But we need to, of course, know why you chose your answer, because that's the really important part, of course. All right, so we could see that, of course, Marco certainly falls under the definition of a family member, because he is the dependent child of the person's spouse or common law partner. Now, Marco's little baby is, of course, under C. So he's a dependent child of the dependent child. All right, and then we could take a look over here, and we could see really that Marco certainly falls under, really ticks all the boxes of being a dependent child. So he's under 22, of course. He's not married. He's not in common law partner with anybody. And of course, he is the biological child of the parent who certainly meets all those requirements that we saw earlier. So for Marco, I think it's a pretty easy yes. We'll look at some of the trickier elements that deal with his brothers and sisters. Oh, and of course, his baby is a yes as well. So we have Olivia. Now, Olivia is married, and it doesn't start off too well because we know that even though she's under 22, well, she's married, so that would mean no. Now, because she is not considered a dependent child, then her baby is not considered a dependent child of a dependent child. So unfortunately, this would be a no for both of these people. And then we have Alberto. So Alberto's 20, he's single, he's a student, and he has a little baby. All right, so again, we can see that it starts off pretty well. So he is under 22, he's not married, and the baby, so this is very much the same situation as his brother who we saw earlier, where the person's under 22, not married, not a common law relationship, and the baby as well would be considered a dependent child of a dependent child. So both of these people would be able to be accompanying. And Beyonce, so Beyonce is 22. All right, and then because she's 22, we have to look, of course, to see if she falls into the exception. So we can see that she's dependent on Tony because she has a physical disability. All right, so she certainly meets that exemption because she is 22, of course, which exceeds the age limit, but she is dependent on Tony because she has a physical disability. All right, so she would qualify, and because she qualifies as a dependent child, well, her baby qualifies as well. Now let's take a look at her twin brother, Emilio. So Emilio is in a common law relationship. He's a student, so he depends on Tony financially. All right, well, we could see that he doesn't qualify because he's financially dependent on Tony, but not because he has a physical or mental condition, but instead because he's a student. Okay, and on top of that as well, this person really doesn't qualify because he's in a common law relationship. So again, he doesn't qualify for those two big reasons there. Now, because he doesn't qualify, his baby doesn't qualify either. So we can see that with Maria sponsoring Tony as her common law partner, for Tony's kids and grandkids, well, only just about half of them can come. So we have Marco, who qualifies, of course, and his kid qualifies as well. We have Alberto, so his brother. They were very much the same situation. And Beyonce, so Beyonce meets that exception, even though she's over the age. Okay, and unfortunately, Olivia, so because Olivia was married, she doesn't qualify. Because Emilio is in a common law relationship and is over the age of, or is 22, which is over the age of a dependent child, well, he doesn't qualify either. But Marco, Alberto, Beyonce, and their kids qualify. Okay, so something that's common all the way through family class, well, all the way through everything really, is that everybody must be included in the application. Now you see this all the way through the regulations, you see this through all the manuals as well, and it's a really important thing to remember as it pertains to your full skills exam. So accompanying, non-accompanying have to be included in the application. Remember that if a person does not include these people in his or her original PR application, they can't be sponsored later. So a scenario that might come up in an exam situation, we have a scenario like this in one of the simulations as well, is if somebody applies under the, let's say, the Federal Skilled Worker Program, he's accepted, he starts his life in Canada, and then he tries to sponsor his wife. And basically, you can't surprise the government. You can't sponsor someone and say, oh no, I just didn't include her on the application because I didn't know I had to. All right, so remember, you have to include everybody in the family portion of the application, whether or not those people are going to be accompanying or accompanying eventually or never accompanying. Now, just to build upon this idea, during the ICCRC Full Skills Exam Prep Seminar last weekend, somebody asked about this question here, and it's a great question to ask. So for all of you, you are getting ready to become immigration consultants, and there are probably some areas of immigration or some rules and regulations that you look at, and you'll say, why do they have this as a regulation? This is one of those areas, and even for myself too, when I started studying to become an RCIC, I had the same question as you. All right, so remember, everybody has to be included in the application because essentially a permanent resident is a permanent resident. You cannot give certain permanent residents certain rights and not give them others. So at the point where somebody is a permanent resident, they're Canadian at that point. Now, the tricky part is that you can't really stop someone from sponsoring somebody. So if somebody has, let's say someone's cousin is a war criminal or a well-known war criminal or something like that, and theoretically it might make the person inadmissible. The reason for this, and this would just be theoretically of course, is because later on you cannot tell this person that he can't sponsor someone else who other people, other permanent residents or other citizens would be able to sponsor, especially with regard to the lonely family member. So if you took a look at that lesson before, you know that if somebody doesn't have anybody in Canada who is, or outside Canada, who's a permanent resident or Canadian citizen, and he or she doesn't have anybody who could be sponsored, that they could sponsor someone who ordinarily would not be able to be sponsored. And you can't give that right to some people and not that right to some other people. So that's why I think in terms, from my understanding, and when I explained this at the seminar last weekend as well, people said that it really helped them to understand why this rule exists. And for you, I hope that clarifies that for you a little bit as well. And essentially remember that as RCICs, you do whatever the government tells you to do. So if they ask you to include everybody, for your clients, you include everybody. Now, another little piece for us to take a look at has to do with updating the application. Now, when people sponsor other people, sometimes the process can take a year or sometimes even longer. And people's lives change, of course, right? So when you take a look at IP 8, Section 5.9, if there are dependent children born after the application is submitted, they would have to update the application before permanent residence is granted. Now, they would advise the immigration office of this. This, of course, has to be in writing, just like everything you do, of course, has to be in writing. And otherwise, there would really be some issues. So when we're looking at changes in family, this would be births and deaths. If somebody changes from accompanying to non-accompanying, all of these little pieces. All right, one outcome of this, of not including a new child, for example, in the application can be seen in Regulation 6. If the family shows up, let's say the parents show up at the border, and they've both been granted permanent residency, and they're coming to Canada to activate it, but they have a new kid with them, a new baby with them, and that baby was not included on the application, they're not going to be able to enter Canada, of course. All right, and as we can see as well, if the person's not included on the application, it's just like anybody else who's not included on the application. You can't sponsor this person later. So it's a really, really, really tricky area, and really important, of course, to update the application. People can't show up to the border with an accompanying child that they did not declare, who's 17 years old. It's the same thing. You can't show up at the border with an accompanying child who is 2 months old. All right, so remember, everybody has to be included in the application, and that includes if someone is born in between when the person applies for PR and when they're granted and when they show up in Canada. Okay, one other little area that we'll talk about here is with regard to people who are unmarried and have dependent children. All right, so a couple who is unmarried, who has a dependent child, that child can be sponsored, of course, by either parent. They have to prove, of course, the relationship, just like everything, just like every family sponsorship. The proof for this would be school records. They would obviously have to prove long-term support, because remember, there has to be a genuine parent-child relationship in all dependent children sponsorship as well. Okay, affidavits as well, and just as a last resort, they could use a DNA test. Okay, with regard to divorces and dependent children who are in the custody of others, this is a tricky little area. So something interesting is that alimony doesn't affect immigration. So if somebody, let's say a couple has a kid and the kid goes to live with the mother and the father is supposed to pay a certain amount of money, that doesn't affect immigration. All right, if let's say the child is in the custody of the mother and the father is, the couple separated, of course, and the father is going to immigrate to Canada as a federal skilled worker, for example. And eventually they'd like to sponsor the child to live in Canada, that child has to be examined as well. Okay, so just a couple little notes over here. The child, it doesn't mean that the child receives PR status if he's examined. Of course, they have to go through the regular process, and maybe it's the ex-wife or ex-partner of the Canadian, that person does not receive status either, just by the virtue of having the child of a Canadian. Now, the lock-in age is also something that will certainly play a role in your life as an RCIC and probably even in the exam. So the lock-in age is, of course, the date when the IRCC receives that completed application package. That's why for all of you, of course, as RCICs, once you pass the full skills exam, of course, it's so important to make sure that you are really submitting perfect applications, because sometimes this can play a role. And the nightmare would be, of course, if you submit an application and you make a mistake, and unfortunately it makes the person's child ineligible because you have to redo the application. Well, of course, for all of you, I mean, you're going through your training, you're becoming RCICs, and the reason that this might play a role in your exam, of course, is simply because the ICCRC would want to make sure that this would never be an issue for you. So let's look at the lock-in age over here. So there are a couple little situations that might come up in real life, maybe, and maybe in the exam, but we really need to be aware of these. So it has to do with the submission of the application itself. So let's say that the IRCC receives the application, and while they have it, well, the person turns 22 while that application is being processed. So these days, most family class applications take, well, the government says 12 months, but in my experience as an RCIC, lately we haven't had anybody at 12 months. Actually, we've had 6 months, well, 6 months, 8 months. I think everything has really been in that timeline. So it's really fantastic. But let's say hypothetically you have a situation where the IRCC receives the application and it's perfect because, of course, you did perfect work as RCICs, but that dependent child turns 22. Well, would that make the dependent child ineligible? No, he would still be accepted and considered part of the family class. Now, what if what if the opposite happens, really? So what if the dependent child has a birthday, and then the application is sent the next day, let's say. All right, and it's received by the IRCC the day after. Well, in that case, it would be rejected simply because the dependent child is not a dependent child. All right, and just a note on the top one where the IRCC receives the completed application, and then the dependent child turns 22. Well, remember, that dependent child must still be unmarried, so not married or in a common law relationship, in order to be considered a dependent child still. So remember, it's the same as everything, really, where a person has to meet the requirements during, of course, when their application is being processed, and of course, even upon entering Canada. There is that slight little exception with the lock-in age, which allows a little bit of leeway, but it's a great theme because it goes across the whole spectrum of immigration, where let's say you have a spousal sponsorship. Well, those people still need to meet the requirements of being spouses when the person activates his or her PR by arriving in Canada. So they need to, of course, meet those requirements still. It's not when you submit the application, if they meet those requirements then, and then they can do whatever they want, right? So really make sure that you're keeping your eyes open when you're looking at those scenarios in the ICCRC Full Skills Exam to make sure that you're not being tricked, really, with anything where a person doesn't meet the requirements any longer. Okay, let's move on to talk about LICO here. Now remember that LICO is a really important area for you to understand in the context of family class, because essentially it plays a role across the entire spectrum of family class. So it plays a role, of course, in sponsoring parents and grandparents, as we saw, in sponsoring last resort family class as well, and we're going to see how this plays a role here in sponsoring spouses and dependent children. Now we'll take a look at this through an example. So we have Jazz over here. Now Jazz is a Canadian citizen, and he fell in love and married Veena. So Veena is from India. Now when we take a look at sponsoring and how LICO plays a role in sponsoring spouses, we know that according to Regulation 133.4, and when you take a look at IP2, Section 17.3, there's an exception here. So LICO is not needed for someone who is sponsoring a spouse, common law partner. But let's take a look at this a little bit deeper as well, just because we can take a look at any tricky little areas that might pop up on your exam. Okay, so what if Veena has a dependent child? So we have Emma over here, who's 15. Now when we take a look at the age right away, we know that 15 means that Emma would probably qualify as a dependent child as long as she's not married. Alright, so there's also an exception for this person as well in terms of LICO. So we can see that LICO is not needed to sponsor a spouse or common law partner or conjugal partner. And now we know that LICO is not needed to sponsor a spouse, common law partner, conjugal partner who has a dependent child who will be accompanying them to Canada. And just to round out our knowledge of LICO here, we can see that Jazz has a dependent child as well. So Jazz's dependent child is from India as well. She's 17, so she's okay in terms of age. And there's no LICO requirement for him to sponsor his dependent child. Now, we need to take a look at Article 39 as well, because just because there is an exception to meeting the LICO in these cases, it doesn't mean that a person doesn't have to have any money, doesn't have to have made any plans or anything like that. They have to have made arrangements, living arrangements, financial arrangements to take care of these people, even though the LICO does not have to be met in this case. Okay, if they don't have any other arrangements, any arrangements other than government support, then they might be excluded under Article 39. Okay, let's go a little bit deeper into this again. Now, what if Emma has a dependent child? In this case, LICO would be needed. So because Jazz would be sponsoring a spouse, in this case, who has a dependent child, Okay, so the exemption for LICO does not play a role in this case. And it's the exact same thing if Jazz is sponsoring a dependent child who has a dependent child. So LICO would have to be met in that case as well. And if Jazz were to sponsor all these people at the same time, LICO would need to be met for 6 people, because we'd have Jazz himself, Veena, Emma, B, Ricky, and D. So let's look what happens after a negative decision. All right, so a person is applying to sponsor a family member and it's rejected. Now, that person has the opportunity to submit extra information to the visa office, and the officer must legally consider the request and must see if it can merit discretion. All right, if it doesn't merit any discretion, then it wouldn't play a role in reversing the rejection or anything like that. If it does, and he finds it relevant, then he can use his discretion a little bit more. So we've seen in pretty much all the lessons on the family class that there is a length of undertaking. And the undertaking is one of those really great topics that plays a role across the entire spectrum of the family class. All right, so for a dependent child, when a person sponsors a dependent child, well, the undertaking is really long. So it's 10 years, or when that dependent child reaches the age of 25, and it's whichever one comes first. So as you can see in the graph over here, if somebody is sponsored when they are 2, let's say when they're 2, they become a PR. So remember, it's not when the person actually is sponsored, it's when the permanent residency is activated that the undertaking begins. So let's say somebody becomes a PR at the age of 3 or 10 or even 14, 15. Well, the maximum duration of that undertaking is going to be 10 years. So for the first example I told you where the person is 3 years old, well, the undertaking will be until he's 13. Okay, and then we have basically when someone is older than 15, well, we know that it's going to end when they reach 25 instead of the 10 years, because if the person is there for 10 years, well, the person will be over 25 years old, so it would automatically end. So you can see that with the rest of the chart here, where you have somebody who is, let's say, 20 years old. Well, that undertaking is going to be 5 years, because the person is going to be 25 in 5 years, and that's when the undertaking ends. All right, for anybody who is over 22 or 22, well, the undertaking is going to be 3 years long. All right, well, a very big thank you for tuning in and joining us for this lesson. I hope it was informative. I hope you have a better idea, of course, of dependent children. So you have your sample questions to work through after this. And even just on a side note, with dependent children, you can have, it's a great topic as well, because you can have a scenario on the exam or even in real life where it seems like a person wants to immigrate and qualifies to immigrate under the Federal Skilled Worker Program, for example, so through express entry. Well, part of your job, of course, is to make sure that if this person wants to move to Canada because of his kids, so he wants his kids to go to Canadian schools, or he thinks it's safer for his kids, and then his kids don't qualify, well, that's a pretty big problem. So dependent children really plays a role in pretty much across the whole spectrum, because even if someone is coming as a millionaire investor or a refugee or anything like that, right? Remember, all of their dependents have to be verified as well. So it's really a great tool to make a fantastic foundation of immigration knowledge for you. So it's been such a pleasure to work through this lesson. If you haven't seen our partners, well, you really should. They're fantastic. So EnglishExamPrep.com is there for IELTS preparation. And it's great. So for your clients who need to take the IELTS exam, it's fantastic preparation. I teach those courses, actually. Of course, you have IDP IELTS who are there to help you and to help your clients as well when you need some help in actually organizing an exam, so getting ready, taking the actual exam. English Exam Prep, of course, is there to help them prepare for the exam. For all of you, you're going to need your CPD courses. We've been getting tons of feedback on the CPD courses, and everyone loves them. So they're for new immigration consultants, and it helps you, of course, meet your ICCRC requirements. So our courses are, of course, accredited from the ICCRC for CPD hours. through that website, so through rciccpd.ca. And then you have Scotiabank as well. So Scotiabank is fantastic. We use them every day, actually, when we use Scotiabank. Even we switched all of our personal accounts even to Scotiabank because they're so amazing. So for all of you, Scotiabank is there to help you as well. Be sure, if you want the direct contacts for all of these groups, go to our website and go to the sponsors or partners section, and you've got the direct contacts for everybody there. All right, so for all of you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been fantastic working with you on this topic. And you have your 3 questions in the videos right after this one. So good luck on those. Keep up the good work. And I'm looking forward to talking with you in those next videos.